Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this workshop. I'm Jen Wilson, and I work for New England Museum Association as Director of Programming and Advocacy. And it's my pleasure to have you all here this afternoon for part 2 of our NAGPRA workshop. I am going to read NEMA's land acknowledgement before we get started, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jan and Claire. So our land acknowledgement is: virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. Today, I'm based out of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, homelands of the Wampanoag people and their allied tribes, past and present. NEMA recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within the colonizing society, which continues the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout New England and beyond. You can use the Indigenous Peoples land map to locate the lands where your museum is located and where you are zooming in from today, and I'll drop that link into the chat in a second. And again, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jan and Claire.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I am here in Denver, Colorado. Colorado is actually the Aboriginal land of 48 Indian tribes. And Claire, would you like to reintroduce yourself?
Absolutely. I am Claire Wilbert, one of Jan's associates. I'm just outside of Darrington, Washington, which is itself outside of Seattle. And I am on the ancestral lands of the Soxhawtl tribe.
So lovely to be here with all of you today. We are looking forward to hearing your reports on your homework. So without further ado, I invite volunteer to go first. And if we have no volunteers, then we will just go down the list in the order that I have you. Would anyone like to go first with their round table presentation, their presentation on your homework? And then we'll make notes on your questions and concerns, and then at the end of all the presentations, we'll address those questions and concerns. So that's the plan: presentations, then addressing questions and concerns, and having discussion. Who would like to go first? Margaret.
Hello, I'm doing it because I want the excuse of being the first person. So everybody else is going to definitely be much better as presentations. And in fact, I didn't prepare anything formal. I just wanted to mention that I took this workshop to make myself look in the records and archives here to make sure we were sort of within compliance, that we were doing the right thing, et cetera. And I come from a university where I work with the anthropology department. So I have always felt really lucky that I have archaeologists who are willing to work with me on NAGPRA issues, et cetera. But actually, I've really learned that there's a whole lot more work I need to be doing. I can't go into all the details because I don't have all the details right now. But I knew coming in that we had done the 1993 summaries and inventories. And I was pretty sure we were compliant with that. And then in 2006, and I was actually here for this, we received a new acquisition transfer from a school district of Native American objects, cultural objects, and we sent NAGPRA lists, et cetera, for that. But then when I went, and we've sometimes gotten some requests for information that I've always replied to. But then when I went into the online sites and inventories, I could find very little for the university or the Flemings. So I'm pursuing that. I'm not sure what that's about. And I've reached out to the faculty members that were working on some of the NAGPRA issues with us over the years, just to clarify why some of these are not public yet. So that's my primary thing. So that's what I'm dealing with.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That's wonderful. I think you encapsulated what a lot of institutions are facing right now. And so you're at the Fleming Art Museum. And what is the parent university?
It's the University of Vermont here in Burlington, Vermont.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. If everyone could share with us what institution you're with at the start of your presentation. I think that would be really useful, especially knowing if it's a museum embedded in a university, historical society, or whatever. That's great. Do we have a volunteer to go next?
Before we
Lots of
move on to that,
hands.
Jan,
Yes.
Margaret, did you have questions?
Were you asking me specifically?
Yes,
Help,
since that was
just
part
help.
2 of the homework.
Questions of help. I think actually I was thinking even from the last session, what really is what it is to really directly work with the different Native American groups that our collections reflect. Because, you know, is it just, you know, we've sent the letters, we did that in 93 and 06, and we've sent some, you know, or been in correspondence since then because of queries usually coming from representatives of those groups. But what are other ways for us to do that outreach? I certainly do understand we're working on our own community work and outreach, especially within the local groups here, which in fact, because I'm in Vermont, are not federally recognized. And that's a whole other complicated story for us. But what does it mean to work on inquiries? And I'm sorry, I'm blanking out on the term, but to reach out to these different groups beyond sending the NAGPRA letters and summaries?
Excellent question. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you reminding us that we were supposed to have 2 questions posed as well. Claire, thank you for that. All right, so I saw some hands up. Can you put them up again? Remind me who put their hands up to go next. Great. Kate, I think I saw you next.
Hello, my name's Kate. I'm a collections manager, recently minted collections manager at the Houston Museum of Natural Science. And very similar story to what Margaret has just shared. We have documentation from 93, 94 of inventories and summaries sent out. And where I kind of am is just trying to reconcile what we have on file here at my institution with what's on file with National NAGPRA. So thank you so much for holding this workshop, Jan and Claire, and also Jen, because it's been hugely helpful. Part 1, the suggestion was to reach out and to go ahead and email the National NAGPRA program. And they were able to respond very quickly within only a couple of days with what they had on file, as well as the details for those inventories and summaries. So right now where I'm at is just the process of going through those and reconciling with what we have, looking for any gaps. Jan, I believe you had shared in part 1 an Excel file. You couldn't see much details about it, but I'm starting to create that to kind of have everything in one place, just an overview of what was sent, where and when. And so that's going to be kind of a long ongoing process. But yeah, so that's where we're at currently. In terms of burning questions, I'm sure there will be so many as the process unfolds, but I guess right now my concerns would be if there are gaps in our records versus what is on record at National NAGPRA, what happens then? And if we should need to create some kind of amendments, sort of what does that process look like? Do you have to do everything all over again? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. We can answer those questions, and if there's time, we can show you what that tracker looks like in more detail so you can see the headers.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. And Charlotte, I think I saw your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah. So I am from the Housatonic Museum of Art, which is in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I am the also newly minted collection manager. I have been here for 6 months. and our director has been here for 9. So we're both still very much figuring stuff out. But like Kate, after our session last week, I reached out to National NAGPRA and they got back to me, and luckily their documents and our documents did reconcile. However, we've gotten a lot since 1993. And so where I'm at right now is trying to figure out what's been done with those objects. Most of them have been classified as like souvenir art or travel art. But I'm not convinced that everything is. Just in going through our database, there have been several objects that someone in the past flagged as do not display. And so I made a list of all of those works because we actually have, I should say, we're within a community college. So we have a student who is going to take that project on and look into those flagged objects and let us know, what the significance of them are. We're looking at like chief's blankets, Katsina dolls, shaman rattles, and masks. And we are mostly a art museum, not a anthropological or natural history museum. So myself and my director have a very surface level understanding of what these objects are. So I guess my questions are, what are the steps for, we are NAGPRA compliant from 1993, but all of the objects since then, what is the process for I guess reporting anything, and like where do we go from, what the student finds if there are objects of, funerary significance or ceremonial significance. What should we be doing in the immediate and the long term?
Thank you so much. Great questions. Everybody has wonderful questions. Who wants to go next? Sarah?
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm Sarah Sherman Clark. I am the Registrar and Collections Manager at Heritage Museums and Gardens in Sandwich, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And I'm relatively new to my position as well. I started last October. In addition to, I kind of wrote up some notes. So I'm going to give just a little backstory on why we are at the place we are right now. In addition to 100-acre garden, 43 American-made automobiles, and an operating 1908 carousel, we have 18,000 items of fine and folk art and material culture. And our collection areas stem from the objects that were collected by Heritage's founder, J.K. Lilly III, and his father, J.K. Lilly Jr., both part of the Lilly pharmaceutical family. So our collection areas are a bit based on their interests. And then in 2015, our board of trustees approved a new collecting policy or new collecting statement. And in the statement, it was decided that in the future, we will collect objects that tell the story of the culture, work, leisure, and life of people of southeastern New England, Cape Cod, and the islands. So shortly after that, our curators did a very comprehensive multi-year assessment of our collection and tiered objects in our collection. 2,000 objects were tiered as potential deaccessions amongst that 2,000 objects are 220 Native American or First Nations people in Canada. Their cultural patrimony and possible sacred objects from the 19th and 20th centuries. And we know we don't have any human remains, and to the best of our knowledge, we don't have any funerary objects. So now we're at the point where we're going to propose these objects for deaccession, and we want to dispose of them. And of course, we want to reconnect them with their tribal, the tribes that may be interested in them. After the workshop last week, my supervisor is like, oh, we have this NAGPRA archive. So it's a very small archive of what we did in the 90s. So I do have a copy of the letter that Heritage sent out. I don't have individual addressed letters or know what object lists went with the letters. We have about 2 to 3 dozen replies or received from tribal institute bodies, people. And they're in folders that say to do, need to reply, tribes will contact us in the future, tribes not interested in information. And then we have various versions of printed spreadsheets that track correspondence with handwritten annotations. I was able to find that we did submit a summary in the NAGPRA database, but I haven't yet emailed to get more information. The staff member working here in the 90s who was working on this project no longer works here, but my supervisor has worked here for 30 years. So she has really good institutional knowledge, but wasn't actively working on this project in the 90s. And so after I went through the archive, a lot of questions came to my mind about how we handle what we have in the archive versus how we're going to move forward with disposing once the items are approved for deaccession. But my larger questions, my 2 official homework questions that might benefit the group are, once we do make contact, how long do we wait to hear from them before we move forward with other disposal methods? We, of course, want to reunite the objects with the right people, but we also want the storage space. We don't want these items. So what are the best practices and the due diligence steps that we should take? How long should we wait? And, what should we be tracking until we make the next move, I guess? And then my second question is, if a tribe doesn't want an object that we're offering, and the object itself has, for example, eagle feathers, something we cannot legally sell, what is the best practice to dispose of them? So again, our goal is we're gonna get rid of these items either way if we reunite them with our tribe, but we're also going to want to know what other ways we can responsibly dispose, especially when they're made of things that we can't sell. So those are my 2 big questions.
Thank you so much. More great questions. I think Claire and I are really looking forward to chatting about all of these. So Sean, you are next in the queue.
Okay. Hello. Hopefully you can all hear me well. I'm the archivist actually at the Boston Children's Museum. Our collections manager recently stepped away to go somewhere else. And in the process, I was helping with a ongoing repatriation claim and kind of was using some of the things that or was looking into some things and found some discrepancies that we are looking into and sorry, to rewind, we have submitted inventories and summaries at the NAGPRA deadline. And as well, there was a video project that was done with some partner museums that was shared, and basically in response to repatriation requests, there's like regional tapes that are on VHSs and that were, I believe, pictures of it were taken, was the form of like digitization that has moved forward since we no longer make copies of VHSs to send out to people. But yes, so there has been some things that are misattributed, and looking further at basically what was on the catalog cards versus looking further into some other documentation that was made in the past that was in the archive that might not have been looked at by people when they were working on the NAGPRA summaries. So that is the thing that we want to look into, basically, is trying to possibly update the summaries. I will say that in addition to the VHSs, that the actual summaries that were sent out are the very like baseline description of objects, and how that might be, how we can expand upon that to make it more useful in repatriation requests, as well as part of that, in looking through NAGPRA files, I found notes from repatriation requests that at least they were acknowledged and things like that. And there was meetings that happened in consultation, but that there was sometimes feedback that was given about that we had things wrong about certain attributions that were not, I have not been able to clearly see if that has been shared back with NAGPRA. It's been used in response to other repatriation claims, but it's not necessarily been shared with the database, updated in their databases. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so we're trying to just make sure that we have more thorough summaries. I think kind of in consultation with our director and the museum at large, or not the director, but VP of the department and everything like that, it's become a conversation about what we can do to, in general, restart some of these conversations in addition to like the summaries, because just in looking through the contacts that we've had in the past, there's definitely like some mid 90s, early 2000s spreadsheets of like reached out to these people, no response, and then the spreadsheet goes unedited for another 5 years or whatever. So kind of just seeing if there's groups and people that we should reach out to, as well as a consideration of how this part of the collection is being used in the first place, and if there's more work we can do around objects that might not, sorry, this is kind of one of my questions, but that might not fall into, they're not funerary, ceremonial, sacred, and at the time we're not considered to have patrimony, cultural patrimony, but like that we are not using them, and what we could do to make sure that if there's people that would want them in these groups, that they could have them, these people. And I think as well, kind of in relation to, in addition to the summaries, I think it's, I wanted to ask what is the possible best practices for sharing information. I think it's kind of already been asked, but like the spreadsheet that was shared or showed before that was blurred out, and that's kind of what I've been working on with any new information I'm finding out about, kind of augmenting what we had in our systems, but also we use like Past Perfect as our catalog system. As far as I know, it's hard to have multiple instances of that, and kind of just what kind of database or like shared document we can send out or send to people to have access to learn more about at least the collection records that we have managed to find, as well as archival notes and accession documentation that we have, just to try to be transparent in the process of helping reunite things, belongings, but making sure that that's not something that becomes publicly accessible in any way. And kind of relatedly, I know there are some things that have clear guidance of that, like they should not be photographed, just because of cultural reasons, and kind of where to draw that line when I might not have the expertise for that. I think at this point I am focusing on written description, documentation, that kind of thing first, but if there is a discussion around digitizing to make the process easier for people who might not be able to travel to Boston for something, what that looks like and where to, I know a lot of that will be in consultation. And sorry, I kind of might have left this out. The third question is just, yeah, no, I kind of said, sorry, but just like restarting consultations basically, and things that we've talked about in the past of, and where to pick that up with people who might not be in positions anymore and things like that.
Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate that. You touched on a lot of things, and I'm looking at Marla because Marla needs to give at least one plug for some work that she has spearheaded. Julia, I believe you had your hand up. Yes, for quite some time.
Sure. I'm one of those kids that got sent to the back of the class because I answered the questions too quickly. So I'm Julia Gray. I'm the executive director at the Wilson Museum in Castine, Maine, where I've been for about 1.5 years. And my collections manager and curator, Abby Dunham, is here with me. And our summer intern, Madeline Smith, is here with me. She's a Tufts grad student, and she's working on NAGPRA prep work in addition to other things this summer. So we're pre-prepping for NAGPRA. We currently are not a museum under the definition of the law because we have not received federal funding, and we've double checked that, and we were pretty sure because there was definitely intent to not take federal funding, to not have to comply with NAGPRA previously. So we're starting from the beginning, and it was really helpful to even just hear the 3-year, 5-year time clock that will kick in. We've applied for an NEH grant and are hoping to apply for a CAP grant. So, you know, God willing, we get those grants, then the clock starts and we start from the beginning. We have done non-NAGPRA repatriation with the tribal nations here in Maine because there's a state law that governs human remains, ancestors, if you're not subject to NAGPRA. So we use that to return all the ancestors, the North American ancestors that we have. We have some Neolithic French ancestors also, but that's a whole nother seminar sometime. We have somewhere in the vicinity, we've got in our current database, we've got about 3,300 items tagged as being native, and then another 7,000 out of a total of 7,000 as cultural, archaeological, or cultural ethnographic. So we're talking, you know, perhaps about 3,500, maybe more items from at least 43 states. And then we have another chunk that are from like the Plains or Northwest or the Southwest. So as I said, we've repatriated ancestors and funerary objects from Maine, and we're continuing consultation with Maine tribal nations about other items in the collection. A lot of that cultural material was collected by archaeologists, but we do have cultural material from non-archaeological contexts, kind of things brought back and donated. Our base collection was from our founder, who was a wealthy summer person here in Castine, who also was a geologist who really wanted to be an archaeologist. And he collected some of it, and then others have donated since. So we have archaeologically collected and then other sources from probably late 19th through the 20th century, or most of the non-archaeological material. A big portion of the archaeological collections were collected by Warren K. Moorhead, who distributed his artifacts far and wide. And those are that's part of why we have so many states to a certain extent. And so we're looking to work collaboratively with folks like Marla to try and reconnect split collections, split/shared collections, so that those material that can come back together again and kind of simplify the consultation process. And we are, our big next step. We have a multi-page document that is a start of a summary of all of the North American Indigenous cultural material that we have. That was just my start when I came on board to get a grasp of how big is this challenge, this project that we'll be facing once we're digging into NAGPRA. And one of the things that Madeline, our summer intern, is tackling is starting to try and develop who the tribal nations are that we're going to be wanting to reach out to with documentation and consultation requests and so on when that starts. A burning question, and then a second one that kind of falls under it. And this was I've had this conversation with Marla and with others, because we don't have any ancestors associated with any of the material that we know of. We may have some faunal collections that may have a human bones in them, but it's not terribly likely. I was kind of thinking in the framework, okay, so all we're dealing with is unassociated funerary objects. But then when you actually look at National NAGPRA webpage and they say, and also if there are human remains in any institution, any museum, then they're associated. And any items made exclusively for burial purposes are also associated funerary objects. So our question about this is, are we starting with summaries or are we starting with inventories? If we don't know if they're associated or unassociated, because we don't know if another museum has human remains and we don't know if they were made exclusively for burial purposes, we're a bit flummoxed as to whether we're supposed to be doing inventories or summaries for those items. And how do we make that determination without consultation? So which again affects which of those processes we go through. And this is a pretty specific one, but it's one that's really that we're really aware of because of a couple of pieces or small collections, is items that were taken off deceased Indigenous people on battlefields. Where do those fall? What category of NAGPRA? Obviously, they seem like they would go somewhere. But that's something that's a kind of very specific but focused question we thought we'd get out there.
Thank you very much, Julia. Right, Marla.
So I was an overachiever and did make a PowerPoint. Do you want me to share that or do you want me to just talk through it?
Please, PowerPoint away. You should have screen sharing capability.
Okay, just a moment. Where is it? Why is it not showing me?
Can you hover down at the bottom for the toolbar? And
there should be a green button for share screen. Okay.
It wasn't showing me PowerPoint as an option. Okay, so let me do that. I'll just give you this version. All right, hang on. Can everybody still see it all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So just super briefly, my name is Marla Taylor. I'm the curator of collections at the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. Just because this is New England, and I have to say this all the time, there are several Peabody institutions in New England, in Massachusetts in particular. They were all founded with the same family money, but we are not related to each other. So I'm not Harvard, I'm not Yale, I'm not Peabody Essex, we're Andover. And just a little bit of background that the Peabody Institute's collection is almost exclusively archaeological and almost exclusively Native American in origin, primarily from North America, but has some Mesoamerican and South American representation as well. And we have more than 600,000 items at last count, if you will. So our institution's been working on NAGPRA compliance since 1990 and working pretty strongly on it. So I didn't do a lot of this, just to be clear. So a snapshot of what's been accomplished at this point, we are aware of 123 sites or localities from 29 different states that are or were represented in the collection and subject to NAGPRA. And to this point, the institution has published 17 notices of intent to repatriate, 35 notices of inventory completion, several corrections and amendments, because I didn't actually count those. And then I realized there was more than I thought there were. I didn't want to go back through it. And all told, those notices have covered over 2,100 ancestors and over 32,000 cultural items. Out of all of that, from 32 sites in 10 different states, 106 ancestors have been reported as culturally unidentifiable, meaning there's no kind of cultural affiliation. So I took Jan and Claire at their word to use all available resources. So I don't know if other people know about the ProPublica repatriation project, and I can drop the link in the chat later, but this is the map that they've generated of our collection and NAGPRA compliance. So I think they have the greenish, bluish shaded states are ones that the Peabody Institute has found cultural affiliation for and published notices. The orange shaded states are culturally unidentifiable locations. And I put those little stars on places that we're actively doing work right now as well. So Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Kentucky. And I'm sure there will be more because there's always more. So what we're working on currently, and this will get into the next slide, so the institution's been around for over 100 years, and only recently I helped lead the first full physical inventory of the collection. And it took about 4 years to complete it. And we found so much, right? So much that hadn't been covered on old NAGPRA notices, or you find a part of an individual that had already been repatriated or had already been covered in a notice. And so we're sort of dealing with some of the implications of that work. And that's what's happening with Massachusetts collections. That's what's happening with Connecticut-based collections, Maine material as well. Warren Moorhead, if anybody doesn't know him, or if you see his name somewhere in your collection, he worked for our institution for about 35 years, and we have his archives. So if he gave your museum items, write to me, and I can probably tell you where they came from and let you know if there's a NAGPRA likely component with it. Because we deal with a lot of split and shared collections that way. And we're also reassessing those culturally unidentifiable inventories as well, so that we can get those remaining ancestors back home. So I was thinking about like next steps. And so I see our future work falling into these categories because we're broadly NAGPRA compliant, of course, but sort of those CUI individuals, as well as items that were found in the collection. And I think something that Jan and Claire, I definitely don't want to step on you here, but I'm listening to other people and I'm reminding myself and want to remind everybody that like you don't know what a funerary object is until you conduct consultation. So you can't decide what is subject to NAGPRA until you have those conversations. And so I think that's a big deal for me with the large amount of work that's been done in the past. They really relied on little pieces of paper or field notes that said, you know, found near a skeleton, something like that. But looking back at it now, I would find a piece of paper next to something and be like 6 feet from skeleton. And so they put it not as a funerary item, as opposed to, you know, something that was closer that would be funerary. Whereas now I would have consultation and be like, what do you think? Tribal individual representative, is that 6 feet from skeleton? Would you still consider that funerary? And if they say yes, I would add that to my inventory, you know? So going back and looking at the work that's been done, I think that's why we've done more amendments and corrections than I realized, was because we find instances like that. And there are new acquisitions and donations. I could tell you some really interesting stories of things that have NAGPRA implications. And of course, you have to deal with those as appropriately as possible, quickly. And the Peabody Institute, for a number of reasons, has ancestors, about 130 ancestors who have been repatriated on paper, as in the notices of inventory completion have been published, but those ancestors remain physically in our care. And there's a number of reasons why that is the case, but I don't want that to be the case. You know, I want people to go home when their tribal community is ready. But that's challenging. Again, I can be more specific in kind of the abstract, but there's some challenges with that. And I don't know if anybody else has that situation, but I'd sort of be curious to hear how other people address that. And then reevaluating, again, those culturally unidentifiable determinations. Because again, you look back at the old notes and they'll say nobody from the Natchez tribe is no longer around. And therefore these individuals who were the Natchez culture clearly cannot be affiliated, and therefore they're CUI. Whereas if you talk to tribes in the Southeast, they'll be like, well, oh, that's our community, you know? And you just have to make those determinations in consultation. So I guess, like, I don't know that I have burning questions so much as I wanted to like ask for some topics to be like discussed, finding ways to work with tribes to get those ancestors physically transferred if they haven't been yet for some reason, and sort of talking about the role of summaries when you recognize that, you don't have the cultural information to determine what is funerary and what is not funerary, and kind of how that gets shared out and turned into notices on the other end to ensure that materials go home. Yeah, and I'm happy, Jan, at some point to talk about ICC or anything like that, but you tell me when.
All right. Thank you so much, Marla. I really appreciate that. Those are great broad topics to talk about. And I think other people have actually touched on those, right, to a certain degree. So that's perfect. And yes, please give ICC a plug and the Northeast NAGPRA Community of Practice a plug right now. Go for it.
Okay. Well, first is there's, I don't know how many of you are aware, there's a national level NAGPRA Community of Practice group that meets every other week online, where you can kind of ask any questions about NAGPRA that you have. Myself and a couple of colleagues created like a spinoff for the Northeastern region of the US, because we have some of our own weirdness to talk about and to have smaller groups. And if you would like to participate in the Northeastern NAGPRA Community of Practice, what we're doing right now is asking people to like give me or give my colleagues your email address, and we'll add you to the list. We don't have a public link, so you have to kind of be invited to be part of the group so that the conversations can be open. So I'll put my email in the chat in a minute, and you can just send me an email that you want to be part of it, and we'll add you to the list. It's once a month meeting. And then the ICC is the Indigenous Collections Care Working Group that myself and another colleague co-founded, and Jan is a part of, where we are working together. We're a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous museum professionals who are working to create a guide and a framework for culturally appropriate collections care of Indigenous collections, sort of creating a guide that's not going to tell you how to house something or what you should or should not digitize, but give you a framework to think about those issues within your institution and within your collection. And that's something that we've been working on for a couple of years now. And if you want to learn more about the ICC work and our guide, I'll also drop that link in the chat as well. But happy to talk more about it if anyone has any specific questions also.
Thank you so much, Marla. I really appreciate that. That definitely, I think, goes along with some of the concerns we've heard already about incorporating Indigenous care into the work that you're doing as a museum professional. Rebecca, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Melius Shehar, and I'm the Manager of Collection Stewardship at the Museum of Science. I'm here with my colleague, Katie Barrett, today. And I feel like so many of my questions have been answered just listening to this group, so I really appreciate everything that you all have shared. Marla's kind of a hard act to follow, but I'll do what I can here. So our institution submitted an inventory in the 1990s listing just one ancestor that we had in our control at the time. But last year we realized that the consultation wasn't done correctly. So we consulted with the affiliated tribe late last year and published a notice of inventory completion. So we're waiting to see if they want to submit the claim letter. We've been in touch with them about that. But more recently, we've found a box of skull fragments. They seem to be from one individual. There's no information with them whatsoever, just a partial number on one fragment. And it seems like the last number from what I can tell. We know that our founding institution had ancestors under its control prior to the 1940s, but those individuals were transferred to the control of the university museum. And so we don't have any of them on site anymore. But based on institutional history, and I'm not an expert, but just the feeling, the color and the texture from this skull, I feel like it's probably another ancestor, even though I have no actual data to back that up. So I guess my question is going to be, where do I go from here on that, besides getting in touch with the university museum to see if we can find a match to the last number in the ID number. I'm concerned that it's an individual who they might have already repatriated and we've found more remains. And then on the summary side, I haven't found any evidence that we submitted a summary in the 90s. And if I could get into the heads of our prior curators, I think probably they thought we didn't have anything that applied, that fell under the categories of materials that needed to be handled under NAGPRA. So in the past couple of months, my colleague Katie and I have been doing an inventory to see, to just document anything we have that we think could be native or from one of the Pacific Island nations. And so far it looks like we only have 150 things, but many of them are found in collection because of poor record keeping during an institutional transition. So we'll be looking at how to work through those pieces. So that's my next question, is it's probably a pretty simple one that the rest of you have worked with already, but just what do we do with found in collection objects to even know who to consult with on them? Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you so much. Corinne, would you like to go next? Corinne, can you unmute? Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was gonna say, Corinne had messaged me a little while ago saying that they were having some laptop issues. So I'm not sure. Yep, she just messaged me again saying that she can't seem to unmute.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I wonder if we can, I don't know if we can unmute for her anymore. We used to be able to do that in the earlier days of Zoom.
I think I can only ask to unmute. Oh,
yeah,
nope, that's it. I can only ask to unmute.
Yeah, all right. Okay. And there's no one else from Corinne's institution here?
Unfortunately not.
Okay, so who haven't we heard from yet? Which institutions? Jordan, would you like to go next? Oh, and Jordan, you need to push the unmute. Yes.
I reminded myself to do that and didn't manage to. I'm Jordan Burson, Director of Collections at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I've been here just shy of 10 years now. And within the first 3 months of starting on the job, I received my one and only NAGPRA inquiry. And at that time, we were in discussion with a prior registrar who was here during the NAGPRA period in the early 1990s, who verbally, and that was all we had to go on, verbally told us that the museum was compliant and had done everything in the early days to be compliant. And there had been Native American skeletal remains here from the 1940s or so that were allegedly repatriated in the 1960s. And there were, above and beyond that, no additional remains or funerary objects to speak of. Well, fast forward almost 10 years, and we're starting to realize that we're not compliant at all. The institution was founded in 1903 as the local historical society, the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. Old Dartmouth refers to the towns along the southeastern Massachusetts coast. Dartmouth encompassed that whole region. Sometime in the 1980s, after many iterations of the New Bedford, of the Whaling Museum name evolving, it was settled on as the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And in 2001, we merged with and acquired the entire collection of the Kendall Whaling Museum in Sharon, Massachusetts. So now we have 3 different entity names of potential interest to research. We poured through all of our filing cabinets. I had our IT personnel go through as far back as they could go with email records, searching for the keyword NAGPRA. And we really came up with very little other than this folklore that had been perpetuated verbally by past registrars and current staff. So now we're at the point of basically starting from scratch. And that's where we're at. I did inquire with Mariah Soriano about those three entity names, and none of them came back with any substantive results in terms of prior compliance or efforts toward compliance. So we're kind of starting from scratch at this point. And that's really as much as I can tell you without having any more documentation.
Thank you, Jordan. So are your questions how to proceed from here?
Well, you know, we're beginning to work with Bernstein and Associates, so I think yes. Yes, that is the main question.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
It's going to be an interesting ride, I'm sure.
Indeed, indeed. All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. This is a safe space, and I think we all need to agree that we're not going to share out beyond these virtual walls what we're hearing from everybody. Okay. So who else haven't we heard from? Any other institutions that haven't reported yet? All right. Thank you all so much for sharing. Really appreciate that. Claire, I know we've had some chat going on, and you've been recording what we've been hearing and the questions. How shall we proceed? Where do you want to start?
Well, let me go ahead and share with everyone what I recorded. I tried to find places of overlap between the questions that you were all asking so that we could sort of tackle this maybe a little bit more holistically. And so let me share my screen. And this is sort of what I came up with in no particular order. What does it look like to engage meaningfully with tribes? What are some best practices for information sharing? How do you balance transparency and privacy? How do you restart communication after a long hiatus with the assumption and expectation that probably the folks you were talking to originally are no longer there? How do you address differences between what's shown in your own records and what National NAGPRA has on file for your institution? What is the process for complying with NAGPRA for previously unreported collections? And I think bigger picture, you know, I think a recap on where to start. Actionable first steps, I think, could be helpful for folks. How does state funding impact NAGPRA? Native American cultural items are outside of the collection's scope, and the museum wants to find a more appropriate custodian. So what does NAGPRA compliance mean for that intention, and what other avenues exist for items that may not fall under NAGPRA, but that the museum shouldn't have, such as eagle feathers? And then how do you know what to describe in an inventory or summary? How do you work with tribes to identify all items that might be covered by NAGPRA? And if your museum doesn't have ancestors, how do you know if funerary objects are associated or unassociated? How do you know whether to report them in a summary or inventory? And how does NAGPRA address items removed from Native American individuals on battlefields? And then I added, how can you approach split and shared collections, since it seems like this is a group where that might be a topic of interest. And then also, how do you approach NAGPRA for founding collections items? Oh, and it looks like Corinne was actually able to post in the chat. Our museum is privately funded, so we have not been NAGPRA compliant, but I did apply for an NEH collection assessment grant. So my understanding is that if we get that, the compliance clock starts. Additionally, a specific collection of Indigenous items are on permanent loan to another institution that recently got federal funding. How does that dynamic work?
All right, so Claire, do you want to add those to our list? And
Absolutely.
maybe the first one was there already because we actually have the Wilson, I believe it is, that is about to embark on NAGPRA compliance because of federal funding for the first time. And I will say, Marla, that your institution doesn't receive federal funding. Is that correct?
That's correct. We don't. We have in the past, in the 90s, they received NAGPRA grant funding, but we don't now. So yeah, we still comply because we did accept those NAGPRA grants, and it's just the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think your institution actually embarked on NAGPRA compliance, even though you weren't required to. You didn't meet the definition of museum, and then you applied for the grants. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. We're a private institution where they've chosen not, like some of you guys, chosen not to accept federal funding so that they don't have to comply with certain federal regulations. So think what you will of that.
So it is an option to comply with NAGPRA, even if your institution doesn't receive federal funds. Julia, you're
well, so
yes.
yeah, so I asked that of Melanie, and she said because we're not a museum, by their definition, we can't even use their notice system. Like we can't post notices, we can't post any of that stuff because we're not a museum. So that was what so if that's not the case, that means something very different for us, but that's what we were told, is that we can't even use their system because we're not a museum, so we have not received federal funds. Now, Marla has, at the Peabody, they have received federal funds in the past, but we have never. So I'm not sure. That was what, yeah.
Right, and I think there was a different interpretation of whether or not a institution that doesn't receive federal funds could use the notice system or not. In the past, they allowed it, and now that Melanie and the administration has influenced these decisions, they've changed their minds on that. So it's a reinterpretation of what is allowable and what isn't allowable. And I'm going to share another example of that when it comes to the definition of associated funerary objects, how that interpretation has changed over time. Thanks, Marla. Appreciate that. Thanks, Julia. Appreciate that. All right. So Claire, would you mind sharing that list again? And would it be possible to change the bullets to numbers? Because I think it'll be easier to refer to the questions that way. And then did we miss any of your questions? Please let us know if we missed anything or misrepresented any of your questions. You can always add more as we talk. Yes, Sarah.
One of my questions was, and I'm not sure that it's really being represented, was if we do reach out for consultation and they don't want the object, but sorry, that wasn't my question. My question is, we reach out, but we don't hear from them. How long do we wait to receive a reply? Are there best practices? We also, to my knowledge, are not federally funded. So that might influence what the answer to that question might be. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah.
Can I just, make a note about the federal funding? If you guys are state funded in some way, it might be a pass through from federal funding, and you should be aware of that. Like the federal money goes to the state and the state disperses it to cultural organizations, and you still receive federal funding. So I would just encourage you guys to do that, because I'm surprised that there's a number of us on the call that don't accept federal funding. That's unusual in the museum world.
It is very unusual. And thank you for sharing that, Marla. Yeah, I did want to touch on the definition of museum because so many of these institutions appear to not be receiving federal funds. So it is directly or indirectly. And we had one client in Northern California that received a block grant, and that triggered NAGPRA. So, and that's a pass through from the feds to the state, maybe to the county, to the museum. And it is received federal funds at any time. All right. So Claire, do you feel like there's a logical order that we should go in? Should we go from more general to more specific, or do you want to go down the list? What do you think?
Well, I certainly noticed that there were several questions about how you determine what to report and how you sort of work through that process. So maybe we start with those, which are sort of 8 and 9.
Okay, that sounds like a great idea. And Claire, I think you've done quite a few of these projects lately of working with our museum clients, some of which are in the Northeast, to assess what they have. Do you want to talk a little bit about that process?
Absolutely. So as Marla and a couple of other you have rightly pointed out, you may know based on your own records items that are likely to be covered by NAGPRA, but the tribes are really the ones with that expertise and knowledge. So that's sort of always in the back of my head as I'm helping clients assess their collection. And in a couple of cases, we've actually had to start from scratch. These are institutions that, one was a large university that has a collection, primarily lithics and archaeological material, that had never really been cataloged before. And so we actually went through and we gave every item a tracking number. And we actually ended up photographing every item. And we did that because there was so little information that, we were basically going to be giving tribes a comprehensive list of everything in this collection. But because of how little data there was, it was going to be, it's an ads, it's a point, it wasn't going to help them determine if there were items of interest. So we photographed things so that they could then say, look at photos and see if maybe things would jump out as being of interest that way. And so what we ended up doing for this client, a summary can be a general description. And so we typically help clients by drafting, summaries that are usually in the form of a letter. And then we attach a comprehensive list of everything in the collection. In this case, because we were distributing it broadly and we just don't know much about the collection. And so that provides a really good opportunity for you to share what maybe you do have a tag that says removed from a grave. So you can flag that specifically for tribes to look at, but then you're also saying, and then here's everything else that we have. And, please let us know if there's anything else that you think we should be considering. So that's sort of how we start to work through that, what's reported, what's not, what's covered, what's not, part of this process. Jan, did you want to chime in with anything else?
Sure. Yeah. So it's not always appropriate to photograph collections.
Yes.
Oftentimes tribes have very specific instructions on what is appropriate to photograph and what isn't, and who is appropriate to handle a particular type of item. And so we use great caution when making the call to photograph collections in this way. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from tribes on when it is appropriate and when it isn't appropriate. So all this is done in consultation with tribes in a general way and in a specific way for other clients when we're preparing for a new client. And so this gets to, what do you report in a summary? And then once you report something in a summary, do you have to hold on to it forever? If you're saying this is our collection, this is what's under our control, whether it's in our physical custody or it's on long-term loan to another institution, this is what's in our control, and this is what may be sacred cultural patrimony or unassociated funerary objects. And it's my understanding that once you say that in a summary, you really cannot transfer those items to any other institution unless that institution is also complying with NAGPRA. And that's one of the reasons why we write a letter that meets the criteria set out in the summary provision of the regs 10.8. It hits all those points mentioned in 10.8, and then we enclose a list of everything under the control of the institution. But the letter itself is a general description of the collection and really just calling out the known funerary objects. It's tricky, and we don't recommend to clients that they transfer anything that could be covered by NAGPRA, because it would be a violation of NAGPRA. We recommend against it because it is a violation of NAGPRA to transfer anything outside of NAGPRA that is covered by NAGPRA. So it's tricky. And tribes have no deadline for requesting anything covered by NAGPRA. There's no deadline for requesting ancestors, no deadline for requesting associated funerary objects, and no deadline for requesting summary provision items, the sacred cultural patrimony and unassociated funerary objects. I don't know that the drafters of NAGPRA understood that in quite the way it's playing out. But it does enfranchise the tribes to make the call and for them to have no timeline to do that, no deadline for doing that, which is important because most of the NAGPRA reps are also tribal historic preservation officers. They're often religious leaders. They're sometimes government seat holders as well. They have many, many hats, and they just don't have the bandwidth to get to your summary letters and your requests for consultation in a timely fashion as much as they would like to. They often have to put them aside in order to officiate over a funeral, deal with a highway project that is going to go right through a cemetery, and the flooding and the fires that are happening these days. So yeah, when you're developing your summary, think holistically and long-term. And that summary is an invitation to consult. So you want to submit it to all the tribes who may have an interest in the collection and let them decide if they're going to defer. Oftentimes they use the word defer, which isn't in the law. And you often want to ask them what they mean by defer. Does this mean like just put it aside for now, or you have no interest? Should I put that in the file that we just shouldn't communicate with you anymore about this collection? You know, what exactly do you want future museum people to be told about your decision? But even then, they can, you know, the next generation can come in and open the files up again and say, hey, you know what? we've reinvigorated the ceremony. We realize this is needed for it. This is a sacred object. So unlike the summary provision, which is an invitation to consult, which also requires you to reach out to those summary recipients. After you send the letter, it's always a good practice to pick up the phone and call and make sure they received it. The preference actually now is to send those out in email rather than in US mail, because many people aren't working in the office still, and those summaries get lost. We have the luxury of having email addresses for every NAGPRA rep in the country in our database. I know National NAGPRA used to have a contact database. It's now sort of archived in an Excel file and updated as tribes give them information. So it could be a matter of having to call every tribe in the country and ask who their NAGPRA contact is and get an email address. You could also go to the TIPO, NAGPRA website, and see if you can get email addresses off of the NAGPRA website, because most TIPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, are also NAGPRA officials, but not always. So summary, it's invitation to consult, reach out, see how they'd like to proceed. And then with inventory, you need to consult with the tribes who may have an interest as you're developing the inventory. You're consulting with them about cultural affiliation and identification of associated funerary objects. And so that's for ancestors and associated funerary objects. And let's talk a little bit about what an associated funerary object is. It meets the definition of funerary object placed with or near an individual at the time of death or later. And the human remains are in a museum or federal agency's control. Now, today, the way Melanie's office interprets that is those ancestors, those remains, were in a museum or federal agency's control as of November 16th, 1990, as of the date NAGPRA was signed. So they could have already been described in a notice, and the control could have been transferred, and the physical custody could have been transferred, and they could have been reburied already. But those funerary objects never lose their association. So they're still associated funerary objects, which means that they need to be described in an inventory. Marla, did you have a question?
Oh, I can give an example if that
Sure.
would help. So our institution has done a lot of work with Massachusetts Wampanoag people. And there was a lot of collectors on the Cape. And so, for example, there was a small number of ancestors from what was called the Indian Neck Ossuary, kind of on the Cape area. And those ancestors were turned over to the Massachusetts Board of Indian Commissioners right before NAGPRA was passed. And so they were physically transferred, repatriated, and reburied. But after NAGPRA was passed, like in the inventory that we did, we found items from the site itself and then a fragment of that ancestor. So now all of that is like a new notice, a new thing, and all of those materials from the site, even though like a lot of it was done even pre-NAGPRA, that's all subject to the law now as well. And when we do the re-inventory, we find items for people who have already been sent home and reburied, but things that were missing in the catalog when they looked in 2002 versus a really thorough investigation in 2020. And then you find it, and then you have to kind of start over again, do a whole new inventory, notify people through consultation. You have to do the whole thing. You can't just do an amendment in that situation. Did I get that right?
Right. So thank you for that example. Yeah. And then if you are, say, another museum in California, and you realize that Moore had somehow transferred some funerary objects to Santa Barbara that came from these Massachusetts people who had already been described in an inventory and gone through the process, those funerary objects in Santa Barbara would be associated funerary objects still, and they would be described in an inventory. Now, hopefully the Santa Barbara Museum would have the same cultural affiliation determination for those associated funerary objects as the ancestors that had already been through the process. It doesn't always happen that way, though. And I know we have Julia added to the chat an additional point. So is it reasonable to start with a summary and acknowledge that during consultation you may determine that an inventory is needed? Yes, absolutely. And we just worked through that situation. An art museum in the Midwest did their summary, and they reported a grave marker and a burial figure as in their summaries. And as we were getting ready with all the tribes in the state for in-person consultation, it became very evident that those two items are associated funerary objects and needed to be described in an inventory and a notice of inventory completion. Yeah, so through consultation and just having that definition at the forefront of the brain that anytime you have a grave marker, it's going to be an associated funerary object. And most institutions missed that in 1995 when those inventories were due. Yeah, and we actually discovered the reverse too. We had another art museum in the East, on the East Coast, that bought a piece from auction to get it out of the market and get it repatriated. They thought it was an unassociated funerary object. We thought, well, maybe it's an associated funerary object and maybe it needs to go in an inventory. And so we actually described it in a draft inventory and presented it to the tribe. And they said, no, it's fine to stay in the summary. Keep it as an unassociated funerary object. So you never know. But I think summary is the better way to go to start with, rather than assuming. Because we were wrong. What else, Claire?
Let's see. So I think maybe since we had a couple of folks wondering about what you do when you need to start from scratch, that it might be good to just circle back to that.
Okay. Do you want to talk about our initial needs assessment process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it sounds like in at least one of these cases, you had a pretty clear idea of the new items that had been brought in. And Julia, I know in your case, you're sort of anticipating receiving federal funding. So, going through and actually getting a sense for everything that you should be reporting and sharing with the tribes. And then, figuring out what you can to see who might have an interest. So regions, cultures, any of that information that you have access to. And then figuring out what tribes might be associated with those cultures or areas. And I know last week we shared some resources, links to information on identifying Aboriginal land tribes. And so we can definitely share those again. And then from there, making sure that you start that process like we talked about. If it's a summary, make those determinations about, like we talked about, as you report something. If it's summary, you can't do anything with that collection. once you've reported it, you have to wait since tribes don't have a deadline. And then invite consultation with that. If you're describing ancestors or associated funerary objects, tribes that might be culturally affiliated, reach out to them to start consultation as you develop that inventory. Jan, I'll let you chime in as well.
Yeah, I think the most challenging part is identifying what cultures and regions are represented in the collection, and then identifying all the tribes who may have an interest and gathering together their contact information to be able to distribute that not only to the tribes, but the Native Hawaiian organizations who may have an interest, and to the National NAGPRA program. That email is easy, but the rest of them can be challenging. And you can always call National NAGPRA to seek their guidance on how to get those contacts. Yeah, like I said, we have developed a database over the years that has all that information, and you can do that too. It's just really time consuming, and to keep it updated is very demanding, but you do want to keep that updated. And then I would say you also want to go back if you did submit a summary back in before that November 16th, 1993 deadline. You want to go back and reconcile that distribution list with the list of tribes you really think are associated with the collection or may have an interest in the collection, because additional tribes have received recognition since then. And they may have missed some tribes, because like in California, the tribe names are basically the name of a geographic location, and it doesn't indicate what cultures are represented. And so I don't know that you can blame your predecessors too much, because the Department of Interior, which was the precursor to the modern day National NAGPRA program, submitted to all museums in the country 2 lists, a list of everyone in Alaska and a list of everyone in the lower 48. And it was the tribe name and their mailing address, and with no cultures associated with them at all. And it was sorted by zip code. And so a lot of the removal tribes didn't receive summaries, because you maybe had a collection from Michigan and Indiana and Ohio, and all those tribes are now in Oklahoma, or most of them are in Oklahoma now. And for people who didn't know that, they had no reason to look at the Oklahoma zip codes. And and then for Alaska, you may see that your summaries were submitted only to the UNCs, the Alaska Native Corporations, and they weren't sent to the villages. And then the Department of Interior later determined, the attorneys later determined at the suggestion of the GAO that those UNCs should never have had standing under NAGPRA, because NAGPRA was written in a way that excluded them from having standing. And so nothing ever should have been submitted to them. And the villages do have standing. And so National NAGPRA, or the Department of Interior's guidance back in the day, was to just send it to the UNCs, and they'll distribute to the villages. And when the UNCs lost standing, they never oftentimes trickled down to the villages. And so you're starting fresh with the villages in Alaska and information sharing. But that doesn't mean so if you didn't ever send a summary to the villages in Alaska, only to the UNCs, then you need to send a new summary to those villages. But if you sent a summary to the villages and you just want to reinvigorate your communication with them, don't send a new summary, because you've done the summary compliance already, that basic submitting it. instead reinvigorate consultation with a letter. And, maybe say, we sent you this summary in 93, but now we have a database and we're able to give you an itemized list of everything we have. Or we have a website where the database is available to the public, or we have a password protected website for tribes. Here's the link to that, or ask us for the link to it. Or we have a past perfect database, and we have contracted with Culture Code, this lovely little company in Canada that can take our past perfect data or any data from any database and put it into this password protected online web portal that will give you access to all the information about the items. And it provides a two-way communication tool where we can talk to each other about the items right on the portal.
Quick question about Alaska, Jan.
Mhm.
Because the villages can be kind of spread and travel and I assume internet access is not super abundant, what's the best way to get in touch with folks in that area of the world? Is a letter a better way, or a phone call, or does it? Yeah,
Claire,
what's best?
Yeah.
Yeah, Claire is now an expert in communicating with Alaska.
Yep.
Yeah, Claire, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you are absolutely right, Marla. It is very challenging to get in touch with them. And so what I have found works really well is the first thing is know when salmon season is, because no one is available when they're fishing. It is sending an email or making a phone call into the void. So, hold off on communication until folks are back home. I have also found that email, even with communications challenges, is definitely the preference. Start with an email and then follow up with a phone call or two. And, keep trying. Like, I have found lately that folks are actually answering the phone, which is great. If it seems like you're reaching a lot of, this number's been disconnected, this number's out of service, don't give up, give it a couple days and call back. That is, I've seen, is usually weather related. And just keep an eye on what's going on with Alaska weather, and time your communications for good weather days.
Yeah, at one point a typhoon hit the coast of Alaska, and we were working with Museum of the North to write their NAGPRA grant to try to return all the ancestors from Alaska at not only their institution, but nearly every institution in the country. And the typhoon definitely impacted our ability to communicate with them and their ability to communicate with us. Yeah, and their houses are shifting off their foundations now too. So priorities. All right. What else, Claire? Did I miss anything in my lengthy spiel about needs assessment?
I feel like we've actually touched on a lot of the questions that folks had posed. Are there any last minute burning questions that you all have before we all head out? Go for it, Charlotte.
So Jan, you had said if you have done a summary to villages in Alaska, you don't need to do a new one. However, from what I can see in our files, we have sent to individual villages or groups in Alaska, but since then we've gotten more Alaskan related material. Would we then need to do another summary, or is that like an
Yes.
event?
No, yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. So, and we did have a number of questions about the future applicability rule, right? It's when you become a museum for the first time, the future applicability rule applies. That's 43 CFR 10.13. And when you receive additional items or find items or ancestors in the collection, the future applicability rule applies. So you want to look at 43 CFR 10.13. And it tells you that you have 6 months from the time you acquire or find to complete a new summary and share that summary with the tribes and Hawaiian organizations who may have an interest. And if it's ancestors or associated funerary objects, you have 2 years, is it? I don't know why I have such a block against this. 2 years to do that inventory, because it's acknowledged that you need time to consult, right? You have 2 years to consult, determine cultural affiliation, confirm the associated funerary objects, get that into National NAGPRA. And if it's culturally affiliated, then you're also turning in a notice of inventory completion.
Thank you.
And that's the case too for newly recognized tribes. If there's a newly recognized tribe, you need to learn of it and get a summary to them within the time frame established by that reg, and the same for inventory. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for doing such a good job on your homework. It was really, really wonderful. And don't hesitate to reach out to us. Marla, I'll just say, don't hesitate to reach out to Marla. She's a great resource. Don't hesitate to reach out to the National NAGPRA program. They're there to help. Many of you have learned that already, how responsive they can be with information sharing. And we wish you all the best.
Thanks so much, Jan and Claire. This was great. And for everybody, I recorded the session, so I'll probably send out the recording tomorrow for all of you. And I'll also include Jan and Claire's email, and probably yours as well, Marla. If you have any follow-up questions, you have people you can reach out to. If you need Nima for anything, reach out to us too. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone.